5. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this Capita conversation. I'm Joe Waters. I am the co-founder and CEO of Capita. We're a creative platform that works to ensure the flourishing of society, beginning with our youngest children and their families. And we do that within the context of the broader cultural and social transformations of our day. I'm very pleased to have Cecilia Vaca Jones, Executive Director of the Bernard van Leer Foundation in the Netherlands, as our guest today, but she is joining us from her home country in Ecuador. So with that, we are going to begin our conversation with Cecilia. Cecilia, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your background, particularly because you're newly appointed as the Executive Director of the Bernard van Leer Foundation just a few months in. So we'd love to know how you got here.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning to everyone. Here it's good morning, but I'm sure that some people are joining from different places, so it might be good afternoon to you all. So a little bit about my background. I recently joined the foundation as Executive Director since January, but I had been working for the Bernard van Leer Foundation for 3 years as a program director. And it was really fun because before joining the foundation, I worked for the government of Ecuador, almost 10 years in the public sector and 3 years and a half as a Minister of Social Development. So I think the transition of having worked in the public sector to working in the foundation has been really exciting. I'm bringing some of the knowledge of working in the public sector and now working for the philanthropic sector. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Wonderful, great. So, the topic of the day, of the quarter, of the year, perhaps, is of course the COVID-19 pandemic. How are you faring? How are things in Ecuador? And also, how is this changing already your vision for the foundation's work in the next few months and years ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Yes, I was lucky enough, and I feel very grateful I've been able to fly back to Ecuador and to leave the pandemic close to my family. Of course, I'm usually in the Netherlands because that's where the foundation is based. And of course, I started learning about what was happening in Italy. I have half of my family is in Italy. So I was quite concerned already of what the pandemic was bringing to different places around the world, but particularly concerned about the effect that this might have in developing countries. And then in mid-March, I was in Santiago de Chile, and in the last seminar, I was able to attend in person. And instead of flying back to the Netherlands at a very last minute, I decided to come back home to be close to my family. And I knew that we were going to have to change our way of working. So basically, all the foundations started working remotely since the beginning of March, I would say. I think we've been very lucky to be able to continue our work almost normally. But of course, I think that the kind of challenges that we have at the moment are very interesting and demanding. And the main reason I say this is because, as you might know, the Bernard van Leer Foundation works specifically for early childhood development. And we've been doing this for over 50 years around more than 50 countries around the world. And I think that the responsibility that we feel now is that which is the better way that we can support many of our local partners cope with this crisis, as we believe that we need to keep in everybody's mind the importance of sustaining babies and toddlers and families surrounding babies and toddlers. And I think that the challenge that the world is facing at this moment might be putting a lot of babies and toddlers at risk. So as a foundation and as a philanthropic sector, we want to make sure that we can support our partners and we can support many countries around the world, find different solutions that can easily scale to better support families with young kids and babies.
Wonderful. And you made the point the other day in our pre-conversation that you have a concern about this crisis moving us backwards. Can you say more about your concern, but also what do we need to do to ensure that it doesn't and it becomes a launching pad for leaping into the future?
Yeah, one of my main concerns, and probably the fact that I'm back in Ecuador, which is my home country, is that, of course, right now, the stress that many of the health sectors are coping with is also weakening some of the basic services that families with young kids and babies need to access. So I think this is one of my main concerns, because the thing and what we're going to start seeing in many of the developing countries, but also even in developed countries, is that the health systems are basically trying to cope with the crisis and to have a good response to the COVID-19 crisis. But this might mean that in many countries, what's happening is that this is basically enabling some of the basic services, like access to primary services of health, or I'm worried about pregnant women and the way that the pregnant women might be coping to the access to health services. On the other hand, I'm also worried about the whole lockdown. What does this mean for families with young kids and babies? As you know, the first years of life are the most important years of life because of the neurological connections that we have in the first years of life. And for those of you who don't know, um, science nowadays says that babies can make up to 1 million connections per second. And for me, this is always like an impressive evidence, because I cannot even imagine what 1 million neurological connections per second actually represents. But this is what's really happening in the brain of a young baby from 0 to 2 years old. And when you think about that, you think, are we in the current situation of a lockdown allowing babies to actually have these positive connections? Are we making everything that we can in order to stimulate these connections? And I think this is some of the concerns that people working on the early childhood field might be having at the moment. What are the different things that we can do so families and people with young children can cope and really strengthen this way of connecting with their children in a positive way, despite the stress or the difficult moments they might be living? Because of course, for many people, staying home might mean many different things. And I'm again just putting the example of being in Ecuador, with the whole COVID crisis has been pretty hard, especially in the city of Guayaquil. I'm thinking about those families, with babies and toddlers who have already lost somebody in their family. How are they dealing with that? Or I'm thinking about those families living in very small places with a lot of people around them. How are they dealing with social distance, right? Like there's not like a real physical space where families can basically maintain that space that can also help them keep their mental health. And in some of our countries, and I can speak for what's happening in Latin America, but also in many other cities around the world, I know from my colleague in India or my colleagues in Israel and Turkey that the lockdown is pretty severe. So this means that we have a curfew, that we cannot really go out as in many European countries. And this also, from a mental health perspective, might have some consequences. People who cannot like exercise, move, walk, be around like green areas. This definitely has an effect on the way that we also like interact with our young children and babies. So we're trying to find a way as a foundation to really support and advise partners and of course caregivers on which are different ways that we can help them cope with this situation.
So coping is obviously important, but I'm also curious, since you do have an experience in government, are there things that you've seen that governments have done related to the lockdowns and how they have initiated the lockdowns and enforced the lockdowns that you think could have been done differently to ensure that there is more of a buffer in terms of the stress and potentially mental health issues that families are facing?
Yeah, that's interesting because governments have reacted in very different ways, and this has to do with also very different realities and very different contexts. And of course, for example, the fact that I was living in the Netherlands and I was there when the whole crisis started. For example, Northern European governments have been pretty open on the fact that people can leave their houses. So there's quite a lot of freedom to walk, to run on green areas, to use the public space, as far as people are able to respect the social distance. So it's very clear that these policies that government can take are also related to cultural issues around behaviors. And for me, this is really interesting because, for example, on the opposite, what has happened in Latin American countries is that we have had like more restrictive measures. I wonder if this has to do because of social behaviors. Probably in Latin America, it's a lot more difficult to just like enforce the fact that people do need to keep the social distance. Also, because we probably don't have the space to keep that social distance. So I think that the response from governments has been very different. But maybe just to highlight a couple of things, Joe, that I think had been very positive in the way that as we see this whole crisis with COVID-19 unfolding, it's quite interesting to see the new measures that governments might be taking, because of course we're not talking about like a short-term situation, but we're talking about like a midterm and long-term normality that the people need to start getting used to. And I was reading actually, for example, I think many European countries this week have decided to restart some commercial activities. The Netherlands, for example, has pronounced or announced that they're restarting school. But the way that they're doing that is it's slowly getting back to a new normality, basically, because it's not like everybody's back to school. They're taking turns depending on the ages of children. So it's not like an everyday, like in a daily basis back to school. It's like a completely different program. Daycares are going to be reopened from May on, which is quite interesting because I think for first time in history, daycare has been highlighted as a very important supportive service. And I do want to emphasize on this because it's not necessarily the case in most of our protection social systems around the world. We don't usually see daycare as one of the main services that families need in their daily basis. And I think this lockdown and this whole crisis has put daycare in the center of policies as well. And another thing is a lot of the policies around the urban space. And I think that has been really interesting. I've been following some very interesting examples. For example, the Prime Minister in New Zealand immediately investing in pop-up bike trails and improving the conditions of the sidewalks. And I think there are many other cities. There's Mexico City, there's also Bogota, Dublin, Milan, who are already investing in improving the conditions, for example, so cities can be adaptable to better biking conditions, but also this way of seeing the urban space and how can you access things in a walkable distance. I think this is really interesting. So these are also some of the opportunities I see on some of the policies that governments might be taking in order to improve the way and the mobility of people so they can really go back to a normal life. But this also means the new normality will change, right? We're not going to be able to immediately go back to the massive public transport because this might not be the most healthy way to transport in the next few months. But if cities can get prepared, for example, to improve the conditions so people can walk easily around the city, can bike easily around the city, I think this would be like great news for the world and for the air quality and for many other situations that might be happening because of our changes in behaviors and around mobility.
Great. So just a reminder to everyone that we will be taking questions for Cecilia here in the next few minutes. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A tab of the chat box to ask that question. Cecilia, I want to go a little bit deeper on this question of urban space because, of course, the foundation has supported the Urban 95 initiative and has really championed making sure that cities are family-friendly, baby and toddler-friendly, and not just friendly, but really cities are places where there is a promotion of healthy growth and development for young kids. So if you could just explain that initiative for folks who may not be familiar, but then my question is really how you all might be thinking already in terms of how you've already mentioned public transportation, for example, how cities might need to change to ensure longer term social distancing and those sorts of things, and maybe even periodic lockdowns like we're in now, and how, frankly, what is the post-COVID future of cities for young children and families?
Just picking up on your last phrase, what is the COVID-19 future? I want to remain optimistic and really hope that this future is like a positive future for cities and for the way we live. But in order that to happen, I think we really need to create the awareness to among citizens, among people who make the decisions in order to really change some of the things that haven't been working so far. So just let me explain a little bit about the work that we do in the Bernard van Leer Foundation. We have this approach that's called Urban 95. And basically, what we're trying to do is work with cities so at a very local level and trying to work with mayors, with urban planners, sociologists, people who are basically in charge of running the local policies and understand the urban development of a city. And the main reason we're doing this is because when you think about early childhood development, you immediately think about basic services supporting children, which are usually around health, nutrition, education, and social protection. But we forget to see that the way that we can better stimulate and ensure a good development for children has to do with the environment that children grow in. And of course, and we can see the statistics by the year 2050, we might have like 70% of the population living in cities. So there's a lot of children that are currently living in cities, and there's more and more children that will be living in cities. So we got to make sure that the environment where children grow is the best environment possible. So with our approach of Urban 95, what we're trying to do is trying to think the city from the perspective of 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old child. And for me, it's been really like interesting to discover this link between social policy and urban development, which doesn't naturally come together, right? Like when you speak with the early childhood development community, they don't necessarily think about the immediate environment where children are growing up. They're more focused in the immediate services, attending and supporting children. And when you think about, or when you talk with urban planners or people designing cities, they don't necessarily think about the needs of the smallest citizens living in cities. They're most of the time urban planners are thinking about people living in cities, but they don't necessarily see the very specific needs of young children. And what we're trying the point here and the hypothesis is, if we can make cities work for the youngest children, which are the most vulnerable population in the world, these cities will work for any other stage in life. Because if you can make a city work for a baby and a toddler, chances are that that same need is going to be responding to needs of elderly, to needs of disabled people, to needs of women, to need of other people living in the same city. So it's quite an interesting way of measuring needs in cities. And the main issues that we're currently working in our Urban 95 approach are actually around public space, which is quite interesting in the current context. We're also working a lot around mobility, which I already mentioned a couple of examples of what we're doing and thinking in this very specific time that we're living. And one other very interesting thing is we're trying to work with mayors and city planners to really try to understand the need of having specific data that considers young children. So in most cities, you have a lot of data that can be very valuable around urban issues, but you're not necessarily seeing this very specific segment of the population. So we're trying to work around how can we make smart decisions, smart collaboration between urban policies and social policies, understanding what are the needs of the youngest children in living in cities. Let me stop there. So
yeah, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to ask you a question. We have a question here about in North America, the default assumption is that young children need private yards in order to keep active, hence our reliance on single-family housing. How might you counter that argument, that default assumption here in North America?
So what is the default assumption, Joe, again?
That young children need private yards in order to keep active. And that's one of the questions in the Q&A. So keep them coming.
Okay. Yeah. Private yards. Okay, that's interesting. Again, for me, and the most important thing is to think about public spaces and spaces where people can interact and connect. And there's a lot of evidence of the importance of children connecting to other children, but not only to other children, but it's also this connection that children might have with nature, with the environment, with environment, with other adults. So I wouldn't quite agree with the fact that children need a private yard. I would think that children do need space where they can connect. And when I'm saying connect, I'm of course talking about positive connections, but these connections might happen among other children. So the main connection is babies and their caregivers and their parents. Then you have babies with other kids and toddlers. Then you have adults connecting among themselves, which is also very important when you think about caregivers, right? Like if you want to ensure like mental health for caregivers, and this is something that we're very concerned at the moment because of the lockdown. How are like mothers that have their first babies that might have like a kind of a small depression? How are they coping with all this parenting? Responsibilities in such a difficult moments. And most of the time, what we've seen is caregivers need to connect with other caregivers. And as far as they can connect among each other, they can also respond better to their caregiving responsibilities. So for me, connection should happen beyond the private space. Of course, if a family has access to a private space, that's great. But I think that only applies for very privileged families. And most of the population does not have access to a private yard.
Right.
So what cities should do is ensure that everybody has access to a public space.
Right.
Ideally, a green space.
Yes, yeah. And I would add here on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day that our addiction in the United States to suburbs and private yards it also fuels our addiction to cars and to fossil fuels. And frankly, to a level of social alienation for children and families who live in these isolated pockets in suburbs and have to drive everywhere they go and that sort of thing. So I'm in agreement with you. Another question here that we've got about early childhood programs, especially home visiting. In lower income countries, focus on stunting and cognitive development. However, which are good outcomes. However, these programs tend to be very curriculum focused programs, and it appears that these programs could benefit from more of a trauma informed focus. What are your thoughts on balancing curriculum with a trauma informed or relational health focus in the development of programs for young children and families in the future?
What we're seeing, and this is one of the areas where the Bernard van Leer Foundation has a lot of experience, and I myself also, of course, in Ecuador, used to run the home visiting programs and was always interested in seeing the effect of what these home visiting programs were basically achieving as main outcomes. And you're right. I think many of these programs started as a support to eradicate stunting and to improve some key development issues. But many times what happens with this home visiting programs is that they are so focused on following the curriculum that they forget about the basics, the basic stuff on these ages, which is basically ensuring positive interactions between caregivers and young children. Healthy environments so children can actually have this healthy connections with their immediate environments. And this is what we're starting to understand better. What are some additional issues that you can better support some of this, the curriculum of this home visiting programs? Because of course, when you're running a program at scale, you do need to follow a curriculum. You do need to monitor some of the main outcomes that you want to achieve in these visits. But just to put an example, for example, in Brazil, we support one of the biggest home visiting programs, which is called Criança Feliz. What's interesting about this very particular home visiting program that it's linked to a cash transfer program. And this is not usually the case in most countries. I mean, in many countries, you have cash transfer programs, and separately, you have nutrition programs, home visiting programs that kind of manage those issues separately. I think that the fact that Brazil has been able to link cash transfers to home visiting programs is it's quite interesting. And the main reason I find it interesting is, first of all, you're focalizing the most vulnerable families. So basically, what they do is, of course, I think Brazil has 5 million families with children under 5. So they're basically trying to work with the poorest families that are probably facing more challenges than any other families, and trying to give them support and advice on what they can do differently in order to support their young children do better in the future. And one of the things that they have incorporated in their curriculum is around mental health, which I find it really interesting. Because if you think about mental health, it's usually in some countries, it's usually identified through the health systems. But I'm saying it's usually scanned and identified. It's not necessarily refer to a different service to get better support. And we've seen a lot of evidence that there's a lot of mental health issues, problems with, and especially with poor families that are under a lot of stress. So if you're able to combine this cross-sectorial work where you're supporting families, you're giving them advice on how they can not only improve the nutrition of their kids, but they can improve the way they interact, the way they play, the way they talk to their children. And apart from that, you can also refer any case to a separate service that can deal with mental health issues. This is like a really integrated way of supporting families. So I like talking about this example because it's been really interesting to see the effect of what's happening in Brazil. This is a quite new program that has scaled quite fast, but I think it's an interesting practice to consider. And if you think about COVID at the time, I mean, there are many countries that are having cash transfer programs right now just because so many people being unemployed. So maybe there's an opportunity not to only just do cash transfer programs, but actually to link cash transfer programs to protect the youngest and the families with young children. I think that could be an interesting idea to follow on.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to ask about, there's a question here about ensuring the rights of young children with disabilities. And I have seen quite a bit over the last couple of weeks as families who have children with disabilities have been struggling with services for the disabled not being available, whether those are delivered in school or childcare or other contexts. And so the question is, how can we increase the likelihood of making the emergent new normals, post-COVID normals, truly inclusive and protective of the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal commitments, that no one is left behind?
Well, I think disabled as well as early childhood and as well as elderly are all part of this care economy, which is, I think, we were briefly talking about this last time we talked. But I think in Latin America, this is a quite strong concept. The care economy is around how can we better identify this percentage of the population that is taking responsibility for caregiving work, and I think this is, from my perspective, one very important issue that we tend to forget about, and just like value the importance of recognizing what the care economy represents in each of our societies. And just to give you an example, because we did this exercise in Ecuador, if we would have to give like a monetary value to the care responsibilities that most women in Ecuador do, this would represent 15% of the GDP, which would be like the largest income that a country could get, right? I mean, it's huge. It's much higher than what we get for oil, especially now that the price of oil is so low. But just to give you an idea of how important it is to understand what care actually represents in each of our societies and in each of our economies. And what can we do differently, and especially with this families and households that are dealing with this double burden when they have disabled families. Again, I think a lot of it depends on how we organize services. So for me, of course, health services should always be seen as a human right. So all people should have access to health services. And of course, there are some vulnerable groups that would need that access, would need to ensure that access even as a priority group. And among those groups, I would consider, of course, disabled people. But what you've seen, and especially in cities, there are many cities where you can clearly see that there are huge gaps of access to services. And the access to services doesn't only have to do with the fact that you can reach a service or you have the right to reach a service. But in this pandemic, what we've seen is that the access to services actually has to do with a geographical access to service, right? So if because of the pandemic, many of the primary health services are closed or are not close to where families are living, basically you're not allowing these families to access a basic service. And I think this has to do with the way that we plan our cities and the way that we ensure that we can identify where do we have the biggest gaps and how can we completely transform the way that we plan our cities, and how can we ensure as a very basic service access to health services, and for disabled people and for families that care for disabled people in their households. I think this is the most important thing: is to have access to some kind of support to deal with the burden of taking care of a disabled person. But from an urban perspective, there are many other things that are also related to access, of course, right?
So, Cecilia, I know that the foundation focuses on urban and the design of urban places for access of services and ensuring that urban places are child and family friendly and promote healthy development. But I have to ask, what about rural places? And I'm wondering if you all have thought at the foundation about how some of the Urban 95 lessons learned can be applied to helping to meet the needs of rural and smaller towns.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I mean, the way that we deal with some of the rural issues is, of course, through our parenting programs, because, of course, parenting can reach both urban and rural. So for this, for us, it's also very important, just as a general framework, to ensure that we are reaching all children, because we do believe that all children uh, deserve a good start, right? And in order to do that, then you want to make sure that you can reach all children around the world, including children living in rural areas. The way I see it in the very current context is I think children living in rural areas are definitely much better than children living in urban areas, right? Even if for some people, rural areas could be related to poverty, I think it depends on how you're reading poverty. If you're just like seeing poverty from an economic perspective, then yes, I could agree that probably rural areas could be more deprived of some services. But I think that if you have a multidimensional view of seeing poverty, I can see that at the moment, probably families living in rural areas are standing in a much better position than families living in an urban area. And for me, some of the lessons learned of what rural areas shouldn't follow the model of cities are around, first of all, trying to keep natural resources. I think this is very important. Unfortunately, we've seen that in most of our cities, we have lost a lot of green infrastructure. And I think it's very difficult to go back to that, right? I mean, once that a city is covered with pavement and no green infrastructure, it's very difficult to put back green infrastructure. So my one advice in rural areas would be make sure that you can keep the greenery, make sure that you can follow the sustainable pathway that doesn't go into this disruptive way of living where it's hard to access green resources, green and blue infrastructure, I would say. The other important thing is this idea of, I think in rural areas, many times there's a lot more a sense of solidarity and community. Uh, um, and again, I'm probably talking a lot about my own work with rural communities in Ecuador and with indigenous communities. I think there's some very important values on how the life in rural areas can be based on different values on community, on solidarity, and sharing. And I think there's a huge risk of losing that when you move into a city perspective, into a city life, right? Like a life in cities, and we're seeing this in many places. I remember one of the big issues in Europe when they had these problems with very high heat, which is one of the consequences of climate change. They realized that many elderly were dying because of isolation. I think this is something that would hardly ever happen in a rural area because there's a sense of community that if there's an elderly living by himself or herself, people around them would take care of that person. So I think there are many lessons learned about like the risks and the opportunities that living in rural areas can bring. And of course, one of the main things that I must highlight of rural area, I do think that we are eating in cities just because of what we are producing in rural areas. So I think that the keeping this balance present in our current world is very important. I mean, we wouldn't be able to feed ourselves if we wouldn't continue to produce the food we're producing in rural areas.
Great. I'm going to attempt here to combine three questions that have been asked. So bear with me here. And one is the first part of the question, first person's question, which I'll make the first part of this question. How can, what are the opportunities right now to build a case for better early care? And how can this help us get to a new normal? And then Sarah asked about the concept of build back better. And after weather disasters, how can we have a model for how we can build back better rather than just build back to the status quo, what it was before. What is the forum for systematically deciding what changes from the COVID experience we will keep and what we need to maybe do less of? And then final part of this question is from Donald around how can networks in the early care space be most effective in this moment coming out of this pandemic? So sorry, three trying to combine three questions there, and I think you can see them as well. But I wanted to make sure that we got to all of those thoughts.
Yeah. I'm not really following the questions because I'm so concentrated in this brilliant conversation. But I must say, opportunities for better early care, I think there are plenty. And again, the first thing I want to highlight is I think this whole COVID-19 crisis has really shown the importance of caring activities and caregiving activities and responsibilities. And of course, at this moment, if you think about young children and their parents, they have somehow been forced to take responsibility on a 24/7 basis, which is also really demanding. And this has probably strengthened the fact that people realize how important this service is. And hopefully this will allow to improve the services. And I see an opportunity just because of people being more aware of how difficult it is to deal with caregiving in a daily basis, and how difficult it is to deal with caregiving and work together, right? I think this is the main thing that most families are facing at the moment. So I think there's a huge opportunity just to put on top of the agenda the importance of caregiving services as one of the basic services that families should access in any city around the world. And again, as I must, if you think about health services, educational services in most countries are considered as basic services for all families. not necessarily daycare services or care services. And I think there's an important issue to really highlight at a political level, at an advocacy level, the importance of strengthening care services, of improving the salaries of care of people who are running and managing these services, of just like taking action from a policy perspective to really emphasize on the importance of supporting this service in order to allow the rest of the society to perform better as well, right? If you're not able to support families with that, societies are not going to be able to perform in different ways. Changes for after experiencing the COVID experience, I think that the main changes should happen in the urban space, and I'm very I emphasize a lot on this because I think there are lots of behaviors that because of the crisis could really be enforced, right? And I think, as I was given the example, I think this change of mind of, for example, the use of the public space and the use and let's just take streets as an example, right? Like we hardly ever see streets as a public space. We usually see streets as the main space where cars move or where transit happens. But in reality, streets are the largest public space in all cities around the world. So why don't we take streets back to people? Why don't we make sure that after this COVID crisis, we can think about streets as the public space where people interact, where people can play, where people can easily walk, where people can bike safely? Why don't we really take this opportunity to really enforce this as a political advocacy to just like change the way we move around cities? And I think that there's some cities that are already doing this even during the crisis, and I think this is setting some good examples of what can be done differently. I already gave you an examples, but there's a lot of articles that have been written lately that it's quite interesting to see. I mean, a city like Milan that was very car centered is now like transforming more than 50 kilometers in the city into bike lanes. They're improving the sidewalks. They're really thinking about like a complete different way to move and explore a city. And this from babies and toddlers perspective is very useful because the way that babies and toddlers explore a city is basically stimulating either in a positive or negative way their brain. So we want to make sure that after COVID-19, we have more opportunities to create positive interactions with children. And finally, on how can we make networks become more effective? I do believe in the power of networks to do this kind of advocacy. So I think that this is the time where networks should work together in order to emphasize on very specific issues that could improve the life of young children, babies, and families with young children and babies. And I believe a lot in the power of local networks because if I have to compare on what's happening during the COVID crisis in Africa to what's happening in India and to what's happening in Europe or what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in South America, I think it's very different contexts and very different realities. But I do believe there's a huge opportunity for regional networks to really bring and work together to do some advocacy on very concrete issues that might be affecting their own regions. And I think this is a very important thing to do at the moment. And again, to give you an example from Latin America and South America at the moment, one of the big issues that we're facing at the moment is what's happening with migrant population, right? We have a lot of migrants coming, especially from Venezuela at the moment. And unfortunately, this are the most vulnerable population at the moment because they don't have access to any kind of service. So is there any way that as a regional network, we can respond to that? And can we agree on different ways to also support this population, which is a population at risk? But I know this might be the same or a similar issue in the Middle East, right? Like we have a lot of countries in the Middle East that are constantly receiving a lot of migrants and refugees. So what are our like own responses to that? So I think it's a unique moment to bring networks to work together, especially for advocacy work.
Wonderful. I want to go back to caregiving and the role of essential caregivers, and you spoke. I certainly am in agreement with you around, one of the things that needs to come out of this crisis is that we need to more clearly value both the work of caregivers, but also access to caregiving services. There is a question here too about governments directly supporting caregivers, those who maybe choose to stay home, or who work outside of the home, and maybe a parent or a grandparent or another relative takes care of children. So I'm just curious if you've seen any examples around the world, or you all have supported examples around the world of where caregivers are essentially directly paid to do the care work that they would probably do otherwise on a voluntary basis within the family.
Yeah, I know of some countries that have done important efforts to recognize caregivers' work, and in some places known as domestic work as well, which is, you could question the meaning of that, but it's quite interesting to see. And just to give you an example, Uruguay developed like a whole proposal that was approved by law on the care economy, and there basically what they were trying to do is to recognize a small wage for people who decided to take the responsibility of caring for their young kids or elderly, and to get like a small wage for that. In other countries, and this is quite common, is also recognizing that. And I'm relating this to a gender issue as well, because more of the care activities are taken by women in most countries around the world. And for example, one thing that we did in Ecuador, which was quite interesting, is what was recognizing the work that women were doing by taking care of young children or elderly, and allow them to make like a small contribution to the pension system. Because one of the problems with people who are taking caring responsibilities is that they usually do not contribute to the pension system, which means that if they don't contribute while they're active in their productive life, this might mean that they will never reach the conditions to get like a fair pension. So what many countries have done is like recognize that even though they're not getting like an economic remuneration for the work they do, they should still have the right to be a part of a contribution system or a social welfare system that allows them to have some social benefits in their late years, or if they get any kind of disability, or if they get sick. And I think this is the minimum that countries should be thinking about, like recognizing that caring responsibility is a lot of work, and that for that we need to make sure that we recognize that work in different ways. Ideally, they should be recognized with a small wage, but of course also with access to different rights, and especially the rights related to social to pensions, which I think it's one of the most common things that people who decide to do caregiving are not contributing to the system, and then they end up losing, if you want to put it in a more clear way. But of course, I think it's quite interesting to see how different countries support this in different ways. So many countries, I know even in the Netherlands that I'm currently working, I know that, for example, there, if you can have you can have access to daycare if both parents work. If one of the parents is not working, then you don't get any subvention from the government for daycare, which is quite interesting, because then you're basically forcing one of the parents to actually give up other things. But yes, lots of different measures that can be taken from a public perspective, and I think that the important thing is to put it on top of the agenda. And if we are not able to realize this at this moment, I cannot think about any other moment this becoming more relevant and important.
Yeah, wonderful. We have about 11 minutes, and of course, as with these things, the hour has flown by, and I have three more questions that I want to ask you. The first question is from our audience about food production and rural areas. And as we think about the right to adequate nutrition for young children and sort of the strain that some food supply chains are facing right now, and also too just the presence of people at home and not traveling. What does that mean in your view for small scale food production in rural areas, and in particular how we can get a better deal for rural food producers out of this crisis, given maybe a newfound urban recognition of the importance of locally sourced food in a period of time when global supply chains are under strain?
Yes, I think we're already starting to see locally sourced as one of the key issues in order to support the whole food chain. And I do think, again, in the urban context, I think one policy that has been quite interesting in many cities is like promoting and sustaining gardening in the cities. So again, this has to do with having policies towards green infrastructure, but having or creating this possibilities of using different public spaces or having access to locally produced food is definitely like an important thing to ensure at the moment. I hear more and more this idea of circular economy, which means countries being able to produce their own things and avoid importing, exporting a lot of food resources. And I think this is going to become more and more popular. And this, of course, could have a lot of effect in different economies, right? Like, I mean, many countries do depend on whatever they export in from the food perspective. Um, but I also think that the advantage of promoting a circular economy is actually strengthening the ways that we can support these small producers, which is also very important because this is what I think in the new normality we should be promoting more. Like instead of just having this policy supporting the big food chains, I think it would be more important to support the small producers because this we're talking about the very small economies that are probably sustaining the most vulnerable households. So I think from a policy perspective, if I would have to prioritize something, I would definitely go for supporting small producers that will be sustaining the life of many, but will be, of course, responsible for sustaining the livelihood of their own families, which are probably at much more risk than the big companies. Um, and again, this also has to do with a change in our own behaviors, right? Like what are the kind of foods that we're consuming? Are we eating a lot of processed food? Are we eating a lot of natural food? And this again has to do with many like nurturing and nutritious policies that we could be supporting in many different ways. And one very important thing related to food, and I think it's very important in this context. Um, I was talking to people from WHO and PAHO, and apparently, due to some of the current measures, um, breastfeeding indexes might be at risk of decreasing, which would be like a huge loss of the crisis. So one very important behavior to really work on, and this has to do with the kind of protocols that we create to cope with the crisis. I've heard that in some countries, one of the protocols is that pregnant women giving birth shouldn't have like immediate contact with their babies because of the risk of COVID. And this is completely wrong because I mean, if you break this protocol of bringing children to their moms immediately after delivering, I mean, the main reason we do that is to promote breastfeeding. So I did want to highlight this because I think this is one of the important behaviors that we shouldn't be risking for any reason.
Great. And then you and I had also talked last week about some assumptions that are made about middle income countries in a crisis like this. And the assumption that middle income countries are doing fine, and yet you pointed out that there continues to be extreme inequity that puts populations in those countries at severe risk as a result of both pandemic and global recession and whatever comes next. Can you speak a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, and here again, I of course I'm very biased because I'm Ecuadorian and I come from Latin America, but I think this refers exactly to what's happening in Latin America. We have almost all Latin American countries are considered middle income countries, but Latin American still remains as the most inequitable region in the world, and this has huge consequences in the current crisis. Because you have a very large percentage of the population that will have terrible, the consequences for the vulnerable population living in the region are just going to be terrible. And what I'm worried about, and I think I mentioned this to you, Joe, is that in many global discussions, I don't see the region being one of the regions of concerns. And of course, I'm aware of the needs of other regions. I'm also very committed to the needs of other regions. But I do think it's important to see what's happening in these middle income countries and what's happening with the structures of basic services. Because as we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, the impact that, for example, health services, educational services will have due to this crisis are terrible. And of course, the people who will be paying for those consequences are the most vulnerable families. So how are we going to be able to better support those families, and how are we going to be able to support the system so they can go along with the crisis? For me, this remains as the open question and the open concern on how can we better support governments to really understand these huge gaps that will remain after this crisis.
Great. And then our final question, what is one project you've dreamed about but haven't started yet?
One project, I tend to have too many dreams and projects, but I probably want to share one with you, which is one that I haven't really started, but I've been planning a lot, which is I love my home city, which is Quito. For those of you who have been in Quito, it's a beautiful colonial city that was, I think it was the first city to be declared a site for UNESCO. So it's very well known for that. So my dream is to work at a very local level, at a city level, hopefully in Quito. But my dream is to run like a small bed and breakfast in the old part of town. And ideally, I think that the old part of town in Quito would be one of the areas that I hope in the future can become like a car-free area. So I really, this is my dream. I would really want the old part of town of Quito to become like a car-free area where we can enjoy the public space around the whole old part of town. Ideally, I would love Quito to become a much more sustainable city, but I would like to start as my personal dream to support at least the old part of town become like a pedestrian area and a green area where people can really have a better condition of living.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I'm thrilled that we had such a great participation from Nairobi to New Delhi, Cape Town to Scotland, and many, many points all over the world. So thank you for taking the time. Cecilia, thank you. Be well, stay safe, and we look forward to keeping in touch with your work and the work of the Bernard van Leer Foundation. Everybody have a great day, and thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joe.